News in the air. Hawaiian Airlines, which inaugurated inter-island service back in 1929, celebrates their 60th anniversary. Through the years, Hawaiian set the standards for comfort and convenience, sharing the secrets of neighbor islands with the world. Today, Hawaiian Airlines continues these proud traditions, bringing the warmth of Hawaii to destinations across the Pacific from Sydney to San Francisco. For 60 years, Hawaiian Airlines has been and continues to be first in the Hawaiian skies.
In 1859, the first steps to bring modern medicine to Hawaii were taken by King Kamehameha IV and the young Queen Emma. To realize their vision, they built the Queen's Hospital, an oasis of healing. Over the years, we've grown to become the largest, most progressive medical center in the Pacific Basin, the Queen's Medical Center, celebrating 130 years of healing.
Sending flowers means sending information long distance. However, during busy periods like Mother's Day, connections aren't always made in time. So this year, FTD switched to U.S. Sprint and successfully processed over 2 million orders. Of course, some results simply can't be measured. 100% digital fiber optic data, only from U.S. Sprint.
Baby.
The Miss America Beauty Pageant, 1959. Among the contenders is 19-year-old Miss Hawaii, Gordine Leilahua Lee, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Gordine Lee of Palolo Valley, Oahu. 5 foot 4 inches tall, 118 pounds. Then as now, the people of the islands liked their Miss Hawaiis to be multi-ethnic, multicultural. Cosmopolitan was the word often used to describe it. Gordine Lee certainly fit the bill. Hawaiian, Chinese, English, Scottish, American Indian. Her talent for the competition? Hula, of course. The very presence of such a cosmopolitan contender as Gordine at the Miss America pageant was something of a novelty. In previous decades, the contest had an ironclad rule restricting entrance to, quote, the white race. The Honolulu JCs had challenged the rule and been granted an exception. But it would be decades before blacks and other ethnic groups on the mainland would finally make their way into the pageant in Atlantic City. Though like many others from Hawaii, she would be honored by her peers as Miss Congeniality, Gordine Lee would not win the title of Miss America 1959. She simply did not fit the mold. She was exotic, far, far from home, and most importantly, non-Caucasian.
And that is the very reason why Hawaii took the first 6 decades of the 20th century to become a state. Even though the islands could be loved for their congeniality, they did not fit the mold, particularly when it came to race. Sure, there were other arguments against statehood, but by the late 50s, they didn't hold much punch.
There was the issue of distance. The 48 mainland states were neighbors, and the soon-to-be 49th, Alaska, was, well, just around the corner, and still on the American continent. Hawaii was beyond the blue horizon, out of sight, and therefore out of consideration. World history, of course, had long ago made nonsense of this. Hawaii offered the United States the ultimate attraction of all real estate, location. The islands were among the most strategically placed clumps of rock anywhere on the globe. And indeed, Hawaii had already paid a huge price for that location. On December 7, 1941, Hawaii became the first U.S. territory to endure enemy attack in the 20th century. The big American military installations built up in the islands had drawn disaster to her shores. And for the next 4 decades, it would remain home to the Pacific Fleet and the westernmost arm of American strength. The argument that Hawaii was too far away to matter had simply been knocked to bits by events. World War II would also shatter another notion about Hawaii, that it was a foreign land, undeserving of full American recognition. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the 100th Battalion became famous for their bravery, heroism, and sacrifice. They would return home to the islands as heroes, the most decorated units in the entire United States Army. Children of the islands born from 1898 forward were U.S. citizens by birth. They went to schools named for presidents: Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, McKinley, Roosevelt. And they learned about American democracy from civics teachers who had faith in the textbooks, every word. Post-war Hawaii had a larger population than many other states at the time of their admission. And the territory regularly paid more into the federal treasury than it ever got back. The Cold War fears of the 50s also brought the suggestion that Hawaii's very active labor leaders were communists or communist influenced. The accusations were groundless, but were nevertheless another roadblock to statehood. In short, by all outwardly accepted national standards, Hawaii qualified for statehood. Yet the century rolled on, and Hawaii remained a territory. The people here could not vote for their president or elect their own governor, and their single delegate to Washington could not vote. Rallies were held, and petitions, one an entire city block long, were sent to Congress, to no avail. And so again we come to the issue of race. In no other state in the Union were standard issue white Americans so outnumbered by other ethnic groups. It was no coincidence, therefore, that the most stubborn opponents of statehood were from the South, still a decade away from the civil rights movement. Throughout 34 congressional hearings on statehood, it was the Southerners who held out and held out against Hawaii. As late as 1958, Southerners, like Senator Lyndon Johnson, were still blocking the progress of statehood.
Finally, it seemed clear to me that the majority leader, Mr. Lyndon Johnson, was somehow or other just standing in the way of any motion on this. I said, Mr. Majority Leader, I said, you know, the whole country thinks that now is the time. I said, we've collected 1,500 editorials just this week urging that the Congress pass the bill for statehood now. I said, well, I have right here under my arm, and I open it up. Here's Life magazine, the lead editorial. And he looked at me, and the veins started to come out, and his head got red, and he leaned over till his head was no further than that from me. He said, now let me tell you something, young man. I said, when anything comes up in the Senate, it comes up because I let it come up. And if I don't want it up, it's not going to come up. Now, do you understand that? Not you, not your president or anybody else runs the Senate. I run it. You know, I was just astonished. I backed off, and I got up and sat up, stood up. I've never seen anything like it. It's probably the only man in my whole life I've never liked. I think the Southern opposition was based on civil rights. They didn't want to have two more people in the Senate that were going to be pushing for all kinds of rights for various people. I think that was probably it.
But times were a-changing, and then they could hold out no more. In early 1959, the balance tipped, and the numbers turned decisively against the obstructionists and for statehood.
All 49 states will join in welcoming the new one, Hawaii, to this union. We will wish for her prosperity, security, happiness, and a growing, closer relationship with all of the other states.
And the celebrations began. It was statehood at last. Firecrackers snapped. Cars blasted their horns. Star flags were raised in Honolulu, and a dignified procession made its way from Iolani Palace to Kawaiahau Church.
That was the official procession. But let's imagine a procession of all the people of the island, 600,000 strong, at the very moment when those people of the islands became the population of the 50th state. They marched to the stirring music of the Royal Hawaiian Band, and the procession is led by the statehood babies, little Emily Morisada, and the 17,000 others born in the year 1959. They're young, it's a young state, their parents are young. The average age here is 24 in 1959, the youngest in the United States. And they're hopeful, they look to the future. And yet tragically, only 20% of those that we see marching will ever be able to afford their own house in Hawaii. There's nothing like that anywhere else in the United States. The great props of the economy are military spending and sugar and pineapple, with tourism just over the horizon, and the horizon is very close. Our procession reaches Kapiolani Park, where for the first time the 50th State Fair is held, and the headliners in the concert in the shell are the Kingston Trio, 2 out of 3 local boys, Howley boys, Punahou boys, fresh-faced, crew-cut, clean-cut. At this moment, they are #1 in the nation, and the music they play has nothing to do with Hawaii. Then suddenly, the sweet sound of their singing is drowned out by the fiercest noise in the world, sweeping in over Diamond Head, roaring along Waikiki, across town and out to the airport, a sound never before heard in the islands. This is the sound of the commercial passenger jets. This is the sound of tourism. This is the sound of money. This is the sound of the future.
Perhaps after that imaginary procession, some of the parade watchers come here for a snack to Cow Cow Corner at Kapiolani in Kalakaua and its famous signpost. And looking up, they might ponder, which direction will Hawaii be headed now that statehood has finally arrived? It is a question that will be asked often over the next 30 years.
Queen's Hospital, an oasis of healing. Over the years, we've grown to become the largest, most progressive medical center in the Pacific Basin. The Queen's Medical Center, celebrating 130 years of healing.
News in the air. Hawaiian Airlines, which inaugurated inter-island service back in 1929, celebrates their 60th anniversary. Through the years, Hawaiian set the standards for comfort and convenience, sharing the secrets of neighbor islands with the world. Today, Hawaiian Airlines continues these proud traditions, bringing the warmth of Hawaii to destinations across the Pacific from Sydney to San Francisco. For 60 years, Hawaiian Airlines has been and continues to be first in the Hawaiian skies.
One dry is brewed longer. One dry is brewed from the most expensive ingredients. One dry refreshes completely. One taste, and you'll know why. The one dry is Michelob Dry.
The 60s arrived in the islands on the heels of statehood. These were the Kennedy years, and JFK himself paid a visit to the Hawaiian Islands. Statehood, prosperity, growth. These were the words on most everyone's lips as Hawaii began her first decade as the 50th state. Population was rising, 22% in the 60s. Expectations were rising. and buildings were rising too. This is Waikiki in 1962. The newly completed Foster Tower high-rise is being blasted by critics for blocking the view of Diamond Head. To others, that seems like nitpicking. After all, if you want to see Diamond Head, you just have to move a few feet and look around Foster Tower, right? What's one lousy building going to hurt? And when it came to building and growth, one man stood out in the 60s as king, Henry J. Kaiser. Kaiser was already 77 years old at the coming of statehood, but in the islands he represented the new money, new ideas, new development. Pink was his personal and corporate color, Kaiser pink, from the rosy flush on his bald head to his bulldozers and caterpillars. Henry Kaiser saw the islands as being set for exceptionally rapid growth in the 60s, and he was right, as he usually was about such things. He built the Hawaiian Village, the biggest Waikiki resort in his time. He came up with a visionary new public health plan based on a new hospital he built next to the Aloha Yacht Harbor. And almost single-handedly, he brought suburbia to the islands when he made a $350 million deal with Bishop Estate to develop 6,000 acres in East Honolulu, Hawaii Kai. The new state got immediately plugged into a big national boom, which was part of a big world boom. Hawaii was transported into a speedy delirium of prosperity. Tall buildings rose in Makiki, bordered by Hawaii's first interstate highway, H1. And with the help of Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, ground was broken for a new building based on a new dream, uniting the two worlds that Hawaii lay between, the East-West Center on the University of Hawaii campus. Powering all this growth was tourism, which had taken off, well, like a jet. In 1959, tourist growth was a whopping 43%. In 1960, another 23%, and it continued apace throughout the decade. It was a marketing triumph and a brilliant irony. The islands were presented as remote and exotic, the same characteristics that had caused Hawaii so much suffering during statehood hearings. Ukuleles, luau pig, and the hula had become a spectacular growth industry.
Hey, kids, let's sing that song you like, the one about the sugar cane.
Okay.
C&H, everyone sings.
Even non-tourist industries took advantage of Hawaii's mystique to sell themselves to the world.
That's our sugar.
C&H.
Mommy used to bake her cakes. She makes the greatest cookies, snacks, and candy.
Dandy, Island kids.
Sugar and pineapple were the historic turf of the Big Five: Amfat, Castle and Cook, Alexander and Baldwin, C. Brewer, Theo H. Davies.
Blessed by sun, kissed by rain.
But in the 60s, they raised their sights and looked at possibilities beyond Hawaii, on the mainland, worldwide. It was the start of a hot new trend toward conglomeration and transnationalism. As travel brochures and TV commercials brought Hawaii to the world, advanced communications began to bring more of the world to Hawaii. On November 19th, 1966, the first satellite live TV transmission was beamed to the islands with a college football game between Notre Dame and a Michigan State team that included island boys Charlie Wiedemeyer, Baba Pisa, and barefoot kicker Dick Kinney. The broadcast just about emptied the streets of Honolulu. Pro football arrived the next day, the Packers against the Rams. TV was making waves, and so was radio, with a gravel-voiced DJ named Hal Lewis, J. Akuhead Pupuli to his listeners, and a rowdy group on rock station Kapoi, including Ron Jacobs, Tom Rounds, Jack Kellner, Dave Donnelly, and Tom Moffat, otherwise known as the Poi Boys.
They were fun times, and the Poi Boys, we were just off the wall, and people related to that. We didn't hurt anybody. We were, we didn't say anything blue on the air. It was clean fun. We had rivalries going. I was always the good guy. Jacobs was the bad guy. He was the villain. And we did the wake-a-thon. Tom Round stayed awake for a week, and I bowled against Tom in a bowl-a-thon from Friday until Monday straight, and all for charities. Jacobs and I stood in the corner of Kalakaua and Kapiolani once before the H1. That's where everybody passed by going through shopping downtown. And we just stood there with pails all day collecting money for the Advertiser Christmas Fund.
Back then, there was our population was quite a bit less than it is today. Our tourism, of course, was much less. I still think that Hawaii has its charm, but I think that things are a lot more complicated for young people growing up now.
Here, as on the mainland, the 60s were, if anything, political. Hiram Fong, first Chinese American ever elected to the U.S. Senate, was one of the few Republican stars remaining. Riding the 60s boom for all it was worth were Hawaii Democrats. Young Frank Fossey, a maverick then as now. Patsy Mink, first woman of Japanese American ancestry sent to the House of Representatives. Spark Matsunaga, then a U.S. congressman, now a senator. And one of the brightest stars rising on the Hawaii political scene, Daniel K. Inoue, first Japanese American elected to Congress. But the acknowledged, even revered leader of island Democrats was this man, Jack Burns, 3 times governor, first elected in 1962. The common man's man. He was at home on a construction site or hosting the Queen of England. More than any other single politician, Burns encouraged, engineered, and oversaw the massive development boom of the 60s. Political, business, and community leaders all seemed to be larger than life during the first decade of the Aloha State.
If you're talking larger than life, you're talking Duke Kahanamoku. Duke was his given name, and he was the king of watermen. He could break a world swimming record anytime he felt like it, and sometimes, just so the others wouldn't feel too bad, he could lose to them gracefully. He competed in 4 Olympic Games, and at the last, when really he was swimming not so much against the other athletes as against time itself, it still took Johnny Weissmuller, Tarzan, the future king of the Hollywood jungle, to beat him. Duke made Hollywood movies too. He played Indian chiefs and Hindu thieves and Polynesian savages with a flower behind their ear. But there was never a screenplay to match his real life. For example, one day at Waikiki, with the surf building up like Himalayas on the move, he caught a wave and rode that wave and other waves and caught other waves for 1.5 miles of surfing like no man ever did before or would ever do again. Everybody says they love the Duke, and that's true in his hometown, but it seems like what that means is everybody wants to make money off the Duke. So there's a Duke sports meet, a surf meet, there's a Duke's nightclub, there are Duke musical instruments, ukuleles, Duke sportswear, you name it. At the end of the day, what did that really add up to? He's been dead for 20 years now, and there's still no public statue. For a few years there on Kalakaua Avenue, there was a wax figure in a doorway, the Duke looking dukely, and you could have your photograph taken with him with your arm around his shoulder for a couple of bucks. But that's not the same as a statue, is it?
If there had been a follow-up referendum on statehood in, say, the mid-60s, there's not much doubt that most people would have said it was mostly a good thing. Yet by the end of the decade, life in the islands had begun to go perceptibly sour. And though it was by no means the only issue that provoked growing social and political discontent, an important sign of the times was America's growing involvement in Vietnam. Hawaii was close to the war in many ways. High-level military strategy was based in part at Camp Smith. Island military installations were staging grounds for units on their way to Southeast Asia. And in 1966, the Hawaii-headquartered 25th Infantry Division, known as Tropic Lightning, moved out to fight. Then in 1968, there was a nationwide call-up for Army Reserves and National Guardsmen to active duty in Vietnam. Incredibly, Hawaii, the smallest of states, was tapped for an enormous 17% of the national total of men called up. Protests were sparked, including the sons and daughters of the legendary World War II soldiers from the 442nd and 100th Battalion. It seemed that history was determined to repeat itself and that island boys would pay the price. Many of Hawaii's young men fought well in what would be judged an unjust war. Many died. Many came home forever changed. The decade also ended with some triumph. When the Apollo 11 crew, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, came back exhilarated from mankind's giant leap to the surface of the moon, their first steps on dry ground would be in Honolulu, where they were greeted by a crowd of 25,000. It was the summer of 1969, a crowded moment in the history of the nation and the islands. In just 8 weeks, humankind went to the moon and returned. President Nixon passed through Hawaii on his way to talks that signaled the winding down of the Vietnam War. The first American boys withdrawn were already passing through the islands on their way home. And in August 1969, Admission Day baby Aloha Spencer and the entire Aloha state celebrated their 10th birthdays. With a big bang, likely the biggest hurt in Hawaii since Pearl Harbor Day, the Waikiki Biltmore Hotel is literally blown to pieces. Then, out of the rubble, the lofty twin towers of the Hyatt Regency rise, and alongside it, the shopping arcade called King's Alley.
The 70s are here, and tourism rules supreme. A popular joke these days tells us that the Hawaii state bird should be the crane, the building crane. More and newer and taller hotels are rising along Waikiki Beach, and the neighbor islands are catching up too. First came Maui, which hit the 1 million visitors mark in 1976. The Big Island and Kauai followed behind. In the quest for tourist dollars, there were few geographical limits. And in 1972, the state made a decision which had far-reaching consequences to encourage tourists from Japan. 3 years later, Hawaii welcomed the ultimate in Japanese visitors, Emperor Hirohito and Empress Nagato. As tourism boomed, so did real estate. East Honolulu, the ridgelines above Kahala, Windward Oahu, Makiki, and especially central Oahu, where agricultural lands were turned over to housing, resulting in the brand spanking new community of Mililani. And so the age of the commuter began in Hawaii. Freeways started to overflow. Traffic jams and rush hour had come to paradise. This is the vehicle of choice for the early 70s. Big, wide American cars. Of course, babies like this don't run on regular. They take premium. Lots of it. And in a bitter irony, just as the automobile was being elevated to its highest status ever, that of family member, the great world energy crisis of 1973 struck. And islanders realized that they, of all people on the face of the civilized earth, were the farthest from the hole in the ground where the oil came up. As a result, Hawaii became the first state since World War II to ration gasoline. Lines formed, tempers flared, and gas siphons proliferated. It was an acid test for acting Governor George Ariyoshi, filling out the term for Governor Burns, who had fallen seriously ill. The young Ariyoshi weathered the gas crisis and was elected governor in his own right in 1974, the first American of Japanese ancestry to lead a State of the Union. It marked the beginning of a new political chapter in Hawaii. The tragic death of Jack Burns the next year marked the end of an era. For Burns Democrats, for everyone in Hawaii, it was hard to imagine the state without him.
He was not as articulate as many others in the political and business arena. But somehow or other, he was able to get across the idea or the conviction that he cared. And he cared very deeply. And I think when you look at his administration, there are many things we can pick on, but on balance, it was a superior one. The one that had consideration for all facets of the community. One that knew how to integrate these various facets into a lifestyle and a sense of confidence, self-confidence, so that, you know, when we look into the mirror, we would kind of like what we saw. And Jack did a lot to give us that spirit of self-confidence.
If a statehood referendum were held in the mid-70s, it would likely not have passed as overwhelmingly as a decade before. While life seemed to suit most people, it did not please everyone, and troubled minorities of various kinds began to be heard from. They were on the windward side of Oahu. On the neighbor islands, in Chinatown. There were the victims of Hansen's disease who didn't want to leave their familiar Halemohalu home. Native Hawaiians lived everywhere in the state, including the most heavily built-up areas. And for a number of them, the pressure of development was becoming intolerable. They turned into protesters, along with many locals of other ethnic backgrounds, and some Howleys as well. Many were young, some not so young. Some had been college educated. Some of them had been radicalized by the Vietnam War. Together, it all added up to a movement that demanded attention and came to command respect. And in the most sweeping and impressive protests of the decade, they occupied and reoccupied the bomb-scarred shores of Kaho'olawe in a challenge to the military's use of the island for target practice. They even had a martyr in activist musician George Helm, who drowned in circumstances still unclear. To take on the armed forces of the nation seemed ridiculous, hopeless. And yet by the turn of the decade, the Protect Kaho'olawe Ohana had found many supporters and was negotiating from a position of consolidated strength. No one would have believed it, but it was so. This renewed spirit found a voice in other arenas as well. Hawaiian music, dance, language, technology, and art, all were revived during the 70s in a conscious and spirited attempt to recover traditional skills and strength and have them somehow revalidated in the 20th century. Everything old was new again, and the young found new heroes among their elders. Eddie Kamai and Gabby Pahinui. Iolani Luahini. Mary Kavena Pukui, Genoa Keawe, Raymond Kane, and many others. Thoughtful people began to speak in all seriousness of a Hawaiian Renaissance.
The Hawaiian Renaissance, an idea whose time had come with all the strength and complexity of great and noble ideas and all the travail and pain of a difficult birth into changing times. The great symbol of the Renaissance became the hokulea, an ocean-going double-hulled canoe reconstructed to recreate the exploratory and migratory voyages of the ancient Polynesians. On the first voyage in 1976, indiscipline among the crew, faction fighting, and in the end, fist fighting. On the second voyage in 1978, the tragic drowning of one of the crew members, the great waterman Eddie Aikau. None of this was what the enthusiasts for the hokulea had been wishing for or expecting, of course. But of course, tragedy and potential death took passage on every ancient Polynesian canoe. The thing was to see that the hokulea kept sailing, and it has done so for more than a decade now, in ever-widening voyages among the seas and islands of Polynesia, sailing deeper and deeper, always, into the hearts and minds of island people everywhere.
By the turn of the 80s, many of the players in Hawaii were changing. Most of the Big Five were moving out, the environmentalists moving in. Hawaii Five-0 said goodbye, Magnum PI said hello. Frank Fosse stepped out of the mayor's office, and few thought he would return. Currents were shifting in the 70s, and the course to come was all but impossible to predict. The new decade is marked with a solar eclipse just after dawn, August 10th, 1980. Such astronomical occurrences have often been seen as portents of the future, marking beginnings, endings, and change. So what might this new decade, the Aloha State's third, hold for the islands and her people? Oh yes, eclipses have also been considered harbingers of doom and disaster. There would be some of those on the way, too. Nature brought several of those disasters. Hurricane Eva struck Thanksgiving week 1982, devastating Kauai and plunging Honolulu into hours of rainy darkness. Kilauea volcano began new eruptions in 1983 and then just kept on going all through the 80s. Her lava flows virtually destroyed the Royal Garden subdivision, covered roads and highways, and consumed famous landmarks like the 1860s church built in Puna District by converts of Father Damien. The lava reached the sea, sending plumes of steam thousands of feet into the air. Hawaii is the only state that is still growing geographically. Dozens of acres in the last 2 years. And then there were the disasters crafted entirely by human hands. Throughout the first half of the decade, well after well was closed after island water supplies were found tainted with toxic chemicals used for agriculture and even by casual consumer use. But Hawaii's biggest chemical scare read like a high school text on the food chain. Pineapples were sprayed to kill bugs. The pesticides persisted in the crowns of the pineapple, which were cut off and sold as cattle feed, known as green chop. Dairy cows ate the chop and passed the chemical nasties into their milk, which was then shipped off to supermarkets and schools and consumed by a generation of island children who unknowingly digested unacceptable amounts of the pesticide called heptachlor. The big dairy companies were forced to dump both enormous quantities of milk and the use of green chop. Still, heptachlor lawsuits persisted for years. It wasn't all bad news for the island ecosystem. Concern grew in the 80s about island rainforests, endangered species, the ocean, and alternative energy. Health and environmental issues came of age in the 80s worldwide and in Hawaii.
We find ourselves in the 80s facing those environmental challenges we knew were out there, and some incredible challenges in terms of social costs, healthcare costs, drug abuse, mental health, etc. These horrendous problems that manifest now in trying to make a family structure work in a society. And we not only have this happening, but we also have this tremendous baggage of unmet need from the 60s and 70s, the environmental baggage, the education baggage, all the stuff that wasn't really paid for back then as development went on. So Hawaii now is going to have to catch up for 2 decades in the next 5 to 10 years.
This is island agriculture of a different kind. Green harvest. Local, state, and federal police make an early gathering of what is considered the #1 cash crop in Hawaii, marijuana. The tropical weather is just about perfect for growing the illegal herb, and the preferred terrain of cultivators are forest preserves, state and national parks, abandoned plantation acreage, and the back blocks of failed Big Island subdivisions. Big deal growers stake out their turf with booby traps and guard them with firearms. Innocent hikers stumble onto the fields at their peril. Police helicopters have been fired upon. Local authorities have referred to their own municipalities as outlaw and the Wild West.
Marijuana. Who would have thought that Hawaii, with less than 1% of the land area of the United States, would supply the United States with 25% of its dope? If that sounds a bit extreme, take the long view, look back, and you'll find that Hawaii has always made its money off big, feel-good deals. Think of this: sugar and pineapple, followed by Kona coffee and macadamia nuts. Those are the desserts of life, not the main meal. And tourism, after 50 weeks of hard work on the cold mainland, 2 weeks of warm weather lying in the sun, feeling good. So it shouldn't come as too much of a historical surprise that the main big feel-good deal these days is marijuana. The question is whether we should feel good about that.
White-collar crime found its way into the headlines, too. The continuing settlement of THC Financial and a similar case with Manoa Finance would consume years. But the real blockbuster story was the epic saga of an investment company with the pedigree moniker of Bishop, Baldwin, Dillingham, Rewald, and Wong. Of course, we know now that there were no Bishops, Baldwins, or Dillinghams involved, and no investments for that matter. There was, however, Ron Rewald. He was an 80s version of the 20s kid who came from a small town and made it big in the big city. Impressively big, romantically big. He bought polo ponies, fancy cars, swanky offices, lavish mansions. He courted the rich and famous and was accepted as one of them. Rewald used his credentials, mostly phony it would turn out, to attract investors who in turn helped pay off other investors. It was the ultimate pyramid scheme and would finally collapse with media disclosure, an attempted suicide, arrest, trial, and imprisonment for Rewald.
Will the investors get their money back, Mr. Rewald?
Excuse me.
Where is the money, Mr. Rewald?
The 80s, however, also had some true heroes to admire. Sports figures who triumphed locally, like Merv Lope's Chaminade team that whipped #1 ranked Virginia, and season after season of champion UH Wahine volleyballers. Local boys who made it big, like Russ Francis and others in the NFL, and El Cid Fernandez, the Mets pitcher who found his way to the All-Star game in 1988. And making it big, really big, in Japan were Hawaii's sumo wrestlers Jesse Kuhalua and Saleva'a Tisanoi, also known as Konishiki. Adopted citizen Tom Selleck charmed the pants off just about everyone during Magnum PI's 8-year run here. But standing taller than all was an Eagle Scout from Kona, whose death as a member of the crew of the ill-fated Challenger would be mourned by the state and the entire nation. He was the hero of the 80s, the genuine article, Ellison Onizuka. In business, sugar and pineapple were heading out, while golf courses and foreign investment were pouring in. When wealthy Japanese investors began buying up big pieces of prime real estate at inflated prices, housing costs skyrocketed, and the end is not yet in sight. Developer Chris Hemmeter, who had blown up the Biltmore to build the Hyatt Regency, teamed up with Japanese investors to pursue bigger dreams. First, the Westin Kauai, which sports an art collection that might be described eclectic at best. Then at the Big Island's Hyatt Waikoloa, which includes the traditional Hawaiian monorail and gondolas. A new phrase is born, Hemmeterization. Politically, some old faces said goodbye. Some familiar faces made comebacks, and new faces appeared on the scene. New faces appeared elsewhere, immigrant faces seeking the American dream in the 50th state. Ethnic Chinese, Vietnamese, Filipino, Polynesian, along with more mainland arrivals, all adding their ingredients to the legendary melting pot.
And all the while, a critical milestone was being approached. For the first time in the history of the state, more than 50% of its residents would soon be born somewhere outside of Hawaii. What does this mean for local people of any race who are seeking a local lifestyle among local neighbors? As the Aloha State approaches her 30th anniversary, it is a question to consider.
And so we arrive in present time, 1989, 30th anniversary of statehood. Surprisingly, or not so surprisingly, there are no lavish celebrations, no dancing in the streets. Statehood has simply become an accepted fact.
But just as Gavin Dawes imagined a statehood procession in 1959, let us project who might march in a 1989 parade. Which of Hawaii's citizens would turn out to celebrate the Aloha State's birthday? What would their participation symbolize? After 3 decades of the most rapid and radical change ever in the life of Hawaii, How do the people of the islands appear to us as we watch them pass by our reviewing stand? Like the islands of 1959, Hawaii in the 80s is still a place of endlessly blended racial and ethnic groups, many of which are marking anniversaries of a historically deeper kind. 200 years since the arrival of the first Chinese, 100 years for the Japanese, 100 years for the Portuguese, 75 years for the Filipinos. Each of these groups have outsurvived the plantation system that brought the majority of them to the islands to begin with. Next in the parade are the people that preceded all of those and every other ethnic group, the Native Hawaiians. After 30 years of statehood prosperity, Native Hawaiians are still overrepresented among the economically, educationally, and medically disadvantaged. For some, progress has been too slow, too long delayed. Soon in our parade, we see the Japanese, not the locals of Japanese ancestry, but the Japan Japanese of the 80s, successful, moneyed, looking for investments in the islands. Teachers march in endless ranks. This is their time in the spotlight, with education a top priority on every politician's agenda. But how effective will school reforms be? Or what happens when money gets tight? No one really knows. The business community takes part in our march, the tourist-related job holders, as ever, the largest segment of the group. There are plenty of doctors in our parade, but not enough nurses. Plenty of MBA executives, but not enough counter helpers to serve them at the local fast food restaurants. There are the farmers, the soldiers, the celebrities. But it seems the fastest growing professional group are simply in the business of everybody else's business. Lawyers, up 1,100% since 1959. There are those who may leave as big a mark on the islands in death as in life. And in a special salute, there are the statehood babies, also celebrating their 30th birthdays. Like their parents before them, they must deal with some of the highest living costs in the country. Few of them will be able to afford their own homes either. And finally, bringing up the rear are the children of the Aloha State's first generation.
As the children pass our reviewing stand, we're compelled irresistibly to think of their education. There's no question more important for the rest of the century. It has to be education for the big world, because Hawaii is forever now in the big world. As it is, talented kids in droves go to college on the mainland, and that's good. The question is, will they come home? And will there be honorable work for them in the islands of their birth? Careers, for example, in ocean research, in aquaculture, in ocean thermal energy conversion, careers in research in solar power and wind power, in the conservation of rainforest, careers in preventive medicine, careers in the healthy design of communities, careers in the general feeding of the heart and mind and the human soul, and perhaps above all, careers in politics, because politics can creatively shape or cruelly deform all the rest of life. And if this wonderful accomplishment can be managed, then truly the life of the land can be perpetuated in righteousness.
When the 1989 statehood procession ends, back at the old Cow Corner, we find there have been many changes. First of all, the old restaurant and signpost are gone, replaced first by Coco's, and then by the ultimate in 80s style and values, the Hard Rock Cafe. On that corner, a glass-towered high-rise. On another, a vacant lot, Japanese-owned, by the way, that may or may not be the site for a gigantic convention center, which Hawaii may or may not need. And in the nearby Aloha, old fishermen still try to hook some tilapia for dinner, as they did in the years before statehood. The AAA Car Club tells us that this is one of the most accident-prone intersections in Hawaii, probably because there's just so much confusion about the different directions you can take. And so it would seem for Hawaii's future. Maybe we need a new signpost here to remind us that Hawaii is still the crossroads of the Pacific, and that from here we can get to just about anywhere. All we need to know is which direction to take. I'm Bob Seavey. Aloha.